So we have one enemy, but it would be a whole lot more interesting if we had more than one enemy. And this is where we're going to look at how we can do it using groups in Phaser. So I am going to make a section here for adding in a group of enemies. And to accomplish this, I will then make a reference to it. So this dot is going to be equal to a new Phaser. Oh, sorry, not new Phaser. It's going to be equal to this dot add dot group. So that adds it. Now I want to make a reference to this in my preload. So this dot enemies there. So now we have that. So I've now added a group. So groups are, they work very much like an array. They're a collection. They're a group of like elements. So I'm going to use a simple for loop, and with this, we'll just leave that at array.length right now. We'll call that E, and then we'll figure out how we're adding that in here in just a moment. And with that, I want to add, we'll just try a nice easy number like 8. So we're going to say that E is now equal to a new enemy, and we provide the scene that we're currently in, and we'll start it out at 220 plus 20 times I. So the first time through, our X position will be 220. The next time through, I will be 1, because the first time through, I starts at 0. The next time I will be 1, so 1 times 20 is 20. So that means our next enemy will place at 240, 260, 280, etc. So we work our way across. We'll put them all at 250. And then we need to pass in the texture that we are using for our enemy object. Then what we also want to do with this, and depending on how, we haven't done it, we told the player to collide with the world bounds. And if I look in my map here down at the bottom, I do have one escape where there's not a wall, and I could escape through that hole. So if our wandering monsters get lucky on their wandering, they could go right through and exit out of the world. And now if we had a larger map and we wanted them to be moving, again, we still want them to be contained within the world bounds. So we probably want to even set that up here where we go this dot enemy dot body dot set collide world bounds true. So with that, we will say E dot body dot set collide world bounds true. So now we have attached that to our object, or to our enemy. And now what I want to do, so we can see the difference, I'm going to say E.set_tint, and I will tint these with a subtle blue tone. So 4 9s and then 2 Fs, which gives me kind of a darker blue. So it's not super blue, but we can tell the difference between an untinted enemy. And then I will say this dot enemies dot add E. So this is how we add it to the group. So this is similar to working with an array, where with an array we use array methods like push, which adds it into it. But here we're using add, because that's how it's been constructed. So that takes care of adding the enemies. But we are also going to need to tell the physics to add a collider. And we get to, oh, I forgot add, or collider. and it would be this dot enemies, and we will put in the world layer. So this will allow all of them to collide with the world layer. And now if we look here, we can see we have a bunch of enemies. We'll refresh the page and see it again, and they all take off and park. We can see how they're blue, so we can tell them different from the original enemy, but once they hit the wall, they stop. And it's the same situation we ran into where we didn't provide the update for the enemies in our first go around, so we need to provide the update for the enemies here. And the way that we're able to do that is I can say this dot enemies dot children dot iterate, and then we're going to iterate over each child, and with this child we will just use an anonymous function. We don't need to write out a whole new function for it, and I can say child dot update. So now if we save that, we'll look and we can see how the enemies are motoring around. I think we're going to turn off that logging of that in our code here. In the enemy class, we don't need to log what the new direction is, because with 9 enemies on screen, it's getting a little bit out of hand. So now we can see there's the enemies. Now, technically, they're moving faster than they should for what their animation loop is, but they are motoring and wandering through the world quite nicely. And down here we can see what happens when you construct your map and you just have true random wandering monsters. It is possible that they get trapped. So as you design your environments, it's really important to do some testing so that you don't have your critters get stuck in a corner and be incapable of escaping. Now that we have a number of entities moving around on screen, it seems like it might be time to add a little interaction between them so that, well, when they collide, something happens. So I'm going to create a method. It's going to be handle player enemy collision. And then it will take 2 parameters. We'll call them P and E, which will reference our player and enemy object that are passed into it. And what we can do, very simply, is just say e.explode. Now, we're able to do this because the entity class, and remember that our enemy here is extending entity. And if I look in entity, there's this method here that says we are able to explode our entity. And what we are really doing when we explode it is we are destroying it. So now if I go back here, I'm going to just also log out a statement so we can see the sequence of things happening. And I will say player hit. So we're hit, then the enemy will explode. And we'll see when we destroy it, it removes it from our game so it's no longer part of the game sequence that's happening. And this is different than what we will use when we create our pool of objects to be our projectiles that we will be throwing or shooting at enemies. Those we will use a pool of objects, so we will recycle them. So instead of destroying them, we can set their active state to false and they're visible to false, and we even have a single line that can do that called kill and hide, which then renders an object no longer active or visible. But the object still exists in the game so that we can recycle it, because projectiles or bullets, we want to have an unlimited number of them, but we don't want to create an unlimited number because then that would be a serious memory hit. So to use this collision, I'm going to just go in here and just make a little section where we're going to list all of our collisions so we can find them. And the way that we reference doing collisions is we have two ways of doing it. We're already doing it with colliders, but we also now have a different method, so we can use overlap. So collide will make it happen the moment something hits, and we don't really get the sense that the objects have intersected each other if they have any transparent pixels on their edges, because then it's the bounding box rectangle that defines their physics body when that hits. So that's not as realistic. If we use overlap, it will effectively go into the other object as it's triggering. So that's why we want to use overlap. And then I can say this dot player, comma, this dot enemies, and then this dot handle, player enemy collision, and then null, and this being the scene, and null that is one of. So anytime we do these collisions, we just put these two, null and this, on the end of it. Go read the documentation if you are super curious how that's all going to work out. So now I can see the blue guy disappeared, but the white guy is not disappearing because we never did attach. Oh wow, and there's two little sprites that would have escaped if I hadn't set the world bounds on them to true, because they both ran out that empty. So we can see where it says player hit, entity explode, player hit, entity explode. So now I blew them all up. But that's not really satisfying as that's happening, because, well, they're going away, but we're not really seeing anything happening. So, I mean, eventually we're going to add in a health bar so that we can track how many times we've been hit and how that affects us. But right now we want to, I think, just put some other stuff into this. And there's a couple things that we could do to make this a little bit more fun and exciting. So the first thing that I want to do is I want to set the tint for the player to red. So 0x, 1 FF, 1, 2, 3, 4 zeros, that gives me red. Then I want to add a time event. So this, meaning the scene, well, has a time that it has access to, and we will add a new event. So this would be similar to creating just a basic timer inside of using JavaScript. So we could technically create a timer object in JavaScript, but we have a timer built into Phaser. The language of working with this is a little bit easier, so I would rather just do it this way. So we set our delay, and I'm going to set the delay for half a second or 500 milliseconds. And when this time is up, I want to have it call this set of instructions. So I have to put it into a function. Now, if I had a more complex set of instructions beyond just moving the red tint that we've created, then I would actually, under the callback, call a whole separate defined function. But in this case, because all we're doing is going to say p clear tint to get rid of the red, then it doesn't really warrant creating a whole separate function for it. And then we'll have our callback scope will be this, which is going to be this scene, and we don't want this timer to loop. So now when I hit the enemies, you can see how I turn red for a little bit. I'm still nothing's happening when I hit the white guy, and that's because we have not attached any type of overlap to it. So I could do that. Instead of enemies, we'll just grab that single enemy that we have out there. So now if I run into the white guy, all right, so we're getting the error message. It crashes when the enemy intersects it. And if we look in the entity class, it will destroy the object if the object is not dead. Remembering it has a dead property, and it says it is dead equal to true. And if we check for that first, so if we check to see that this dot enemy dot is dead is not true, and only do our update when that's not true. Now if I save this, now why I'm not, somehow there's something about the sequencing on, because we're grabbing just this single entity versus iterating over the children, and I suspect it has to do with the threading. I don't have an exact answer as why we have to do that, but to be safe, we probably will want to put that here as well if the child is dead is false. So we only do that update when it's not dead. So now works, and run him down. Okay, good. So now it's working. We're not getting the error messages, and now that we see that happening, I'm going to get rid of this because it starts to get a little much as part of it. Now there's another visual effect that I think is kind of fun to put onto this when we are running into them, beyond turning the character red, just to make it a little bit more interesting. What we can do is say this dot cameras dot main dot shake, and we want it to shake for 40 milliseconds, or shift everything 40 pixels, and we want to do it for 0.02 seconds. So now every time I have a collision, you can see how we get this little bump, and it's visually jarring, but it gives a much stronger impression that something has indeed occurred in the game.